Okay, so let's talk about higher voter turnout as we finish up our elections PowerPoint. So, what are the things that lead to higher voter turnout or cause people to more likely vote? And those are a couple things. One, income. As your income goes up, or as income brackets go up, I should say, then those individuals are more likely to vote than lower income individuals. Sex, so male or female. Females tend to vote at a higher rate than males do when you keep all other demographics steady. And that goes with all of these. When you hold all other demographics steady and the only thing you look at is income or sex in this case, then you will notice that females tend to have a higher voter turnout than males do. Age. The older you get, the more likely you are to vote. So if we want young people to vote, then we have to figure out a way to get them to vote for the first time, because once a person votes, the likelihood of them continuing to vote goes up exponentially very quickly. So it's getting them to the polls for the first time. But generally, older generations, 65 or older, 70% of that age bracket turns out to vote, versus in 2016, the 18 to 29 age group, that group turned out only at like 48%. So only 48% of that age group showed up to vote versus the 70% at 65 plus. And it just kind of filters up as that way. Education. So the more educated a person is, the more likely they are to vote. So when you break it down, that's what we notice, that a higher percent of those individuals or a bigger percent of that group tends to vote as you get more education. Race. When you hold everything steady, blacks vote more frequently than whites. Now, of course, when you break it down and you look at it, you go, no, they don't. Like when you look at the demographics, like if you don't hold everything steady, but when you look at, say, you hold everything steady and you look at high income and then you break that high income down into races, you will notice that blacks have a higher percent of their group voting than whites do, even in that. And the same is true on low income or sex or age or education. And typically this has to do with you will see this because, and this is true for sex as well, is because they faced discrimination in the past. They have not had the opportunity to vote at some point in the history of this country. And so once they get it, that tends to get passed on from generation to generation, how important that right to vote is. But if you're low income, regardless of white or black, you're going to vote lower, but blacks will vote more. A greater percent of blacks will vote at a lower income than whites at a lower income. And they see that at every income level and education level. We also are joiners. So we are kind of a nation of joiners. Like we like to join groups. And so if we join groups that value voting, then we are more likely to vote. That's just it. If we join groups that don't value voting and don't think it's important or feel like we don't have an influence in that, then we would be less likely to vote. Impact of the media on elections. The media tends to focus on what's called horse race journalism. Who's in the lead? Who is ahead? Who's in the poll? Who's ahead in this poll today, tomorrow, next week? Who was in the lead last week? How has it changed? This past election, you should have noticed that a lot, that people were constantly talking about who's up in the polls, who's up in the polls, who's up in the polls. That is horse race journalism. That is not focusing on policy. Image. So because of media, the candidates who are running, especially we see this greatly in presidential, but it happens in congressional or representative elections as well as senator elections. they have this image, and the media will help cultivate that image. So they will either show positive images and messages of the candidate, or they will show not. And sometimes that, when we talk media, that's going to get into the media, the bias that the media is going for, especially when we talk cable media. Polling. So the media oftentimes will do polling. The various media organizations will do polling, and then they will release that. Those poll numbers will influence elections. If your candidate is up and it looks like they're up a lot, then that sometimes can depress the vote for that candidate, because people go, oh, I don't need to vote. I don't need to wait. I don't need to, wait in line, take off work that day or whatever it is, because my candidate is so far ahead based on the polling that I don't need to show up. I don't need to go. But the opposite can be true as well. You can also see that your candidate is really like trailing in the polls. And so you can think, oh my God, there's no reason for me to go and vote because they're going to lose anyway. So it doesn't matter if I vote or not for that candidate. They're going to lose. So I'm not going to waste my time. Sometimes the polling, though, will be reversed, especially if your candidate is trailing. That can galvanize some voters, but typically the fear is that's going to cause people just not to show up, because either their candidate is doing really well or seems to be doing really well and they don't need their vote, or they're not doing really well and it doesn't matter because they're going to lose anyway. So reliability of these polls, how reliable are they? Are they asking appropriate questions? How accurate have they been in the past? There is a organization called 538, in which they take all of the polls that have been done and kind of aggregate them into kind of an average, and they rate the polls on how reliable they are. So are they consistent? Are they asking good questions? How are they getting their random sample, and those sorts of things? The impact of the poll, we've talked about this with polling. Polling is a concern, but media puts a lot of emphasis on polling and how the candidates are doing in polling, and we are seeing the effects that less people are likely to answer their phones if they don't know the number, which leads people to not trust the polling. We have trust and confidence in government. So media's job is to convey what the government is doing, to expose any wrongdoings, to highlight what they're doing well, to build trust and confidence in the government. But they can also be there to make us question our trust and confidence in the government. Nixon is a great example of this. We, put all this info, we had all this, the American citizenry had a lot of trust in their government. And because of what happened during the Nixon administration, people started doubting the government a lot. And the media is going to play a role in that. The media's job is to bridge what the government is doing, highlight what the government's doing for the people, but also tell the government what the people want them, like what the people want the government to be focusing on. But when we talk elections, the media is there to help us build, they're there to convey a message, to convey information is what they're there for. All right. Factors impacting voter decision making. So first off, a voter's decision is going to be influenced by their party ID. So are they Republican, Democrat, Pirate Party, Libertarian, Green Party, who is it? That's going to influence how they make their decision on, one, if they show up to vote, two, how they choose to vote. Their voter ideology. Their ideology can be different than their party ID. There are people who are like, I don't fit 100% with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Maybe they don't even fit 50% with either one of those parties. That would be their ideology. Like, how do they feel about each of their areas? And that was back when we did ideology and political socialization. You guys took those ideology quizzes. So you have an ID. Sometimes those don't match up with the party ID that you're going to choose to vote for, because we have the two-party system. So a lot of people, their ideology is not necessarily Democratic or Republican, but those are the two parties that they're going to choose to vote for. The voter religion. religion plays a role in the decision making and how they choose to vote, and which candidates they choose to support. So evangelicals are going to support candidates that are going to promote policy that's going to enhance the evangelical beliefs. Jewish are going to, that's going to influence who they choose to vote for. Islam is going to be the same way. Catholicism is going to be the same way. Christianity, non-evangelical, are going to, religion's going to play a role in their decision making. The demographics of the characteristics, so their gender, their age, their sex, and remember, gender and sex are different. Gender would be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual, queer, plus sex, according to the federal government, is male, female only. So religion, income, education level, all of those things that we've talked about, that influences how a voter makes their decisions. Candidate characteristics. So what is the candidate? Are they, what's their moral code? What are they male, female? Are they religious, not religious? Are they old? Are they young? Are they had military experience, not military experience? So that influences how a voter is going to, make their decision. So the image of the candidate as well as the demographics. So, a lot of people, like when we talk Nixon Kennedy, especially in that very first debate that was, publicized, a lot of people that was on TV, like they all talked about how Kennedy won that, debate on TV, and it's because of the image that he had. Issues. Notice how far down issues is on this list, and it really is really far down for a lot of people. They consider so many other things anymore. Voting is very much kind of tribal, like we belong to a tribe, or ideology versus the issues and where do I stand on those issues, and which candidate supports those issues, which candidate is more in line with me on more issues. We don't, that's really far down the list for a lot of people. And truly, to improve this country, we need to put issues much more at the top. Here's what we believe as citizens the issue is and how we should solve it, which candidate matches that, and kind of get away from ideology and ID and other demographics. Models of voter behavior. So there's a couple of options that people will choose when we go to the ballot to vote. Okay, so they're going to do the rational choice. Who represents my policies the best? Retrospective, meaning they're going to look at the candidate. If they've been in the job before, they're going to look back and say, how did they do their job? Did they do their job well? Fantastic. I'm going to vote for them again. That's part of the incumbency advantage. Because they have a record. If they've held office before, they will look at that. Prospective voting goes, okay, here's a new guy who they're promising how they would, handle certain issues. Do I like that choice? That's who I'm going to vote for then. So rational choice is where do I stand on the issues and which candidate, agrees with me. Which one is the best choice based on the policies, just in general. Retrospective, you look back at a candidate's voting record in, previous offices. Prospective is what are they promising? And then party line voting just means I'm looking at the party. I don't care anything about the demographics. I don't care about moral code. I don't care how they feel about policy. All I care about is the party. And that's what I'm going to vote on. And a lot of people today is their voting party line voting. U.S. voter turnout versus other countries. We have a much lower voter turnout relative to most other industrial democracies. It is really, really low. Really low. Considering, I shouldn't say really low, but we do have a low voter turnout compared. We're talking 20% lower, if not more, compared to some countries. So first off, registrations. We don't like we have to register, and it's a whole separate process, and it's not automatic. And in a lot of countries, you've got to, like, you don't have to register to vote, you just show up. Or it's automatically because you're a citizen, you're registered to vote. But in the United States, you have that choice, and if you don't register, you don't get to vote. Whereas in other countries, that's not a barrier to vote. Or you're required to register, and we don't have that requirement. We have so a lot of countries do what's called proportional representation. That's the PR, proportional representation. So, Oklahoma gets 5 representatives. The top 5 people get those votes. That's not what we do. We have single member districts. That's SMD. You oftentimes hear SMDs, single member districts, also referred to as first past the post. That's the FPTP there, meaning the first person to plurality or past 50% gets to win. In other countries, they do proportional representation where, you get so many seats. You win 40% of the vote, you get 40% of the seats. Compulsory voting. A lot of countries, Australia being one of them, you are required to show up on voting day. I shouldn't say you're not required to vote, but you're required to show up. You got to show up. You got to sign the poll. You got to sign the book that you showed up. And for most people, if I have to go there anyway, then I might as well cast my ballot. I might as well do it. And they just expect it now. And because they have to do it, they're like, well, I might as well be somewhat knowledgeable about the elections. Time and day of the election. So in the United States, we have our elections on a Tuesday. A lot of countries do them on like a weekend. Because it's a weekend, people are less likely to be working. Majority of the country are not working a Saturday and Sunday, but we hold ours on Tuesday. It's in our general election for like president and midterm elections. They established in the Constitution that it was going to be the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November. And it's Tuesday because you could not interfere with church on Sunday. And you had to do, and most people had to take crops and product to market on Wednesday. So that gave them Monday to travel, Tuesday to vote, Wednesday to get their product to market. We also have time. So time of year, it's November. Back when we were very heavy agricultural, that meant that in November, there wasn't anything really to do much with the farm. You're not harvesting, you're not planting, you're not tending to crops. So that works. But we also have very limited windows. Most places are only 12 hours. But of course, under federalism, states can decide that. And there were some places, Houston in Texas, had like a 24-hour. They did a 24-hour window so that overnight they could pull in votes. But really, most places only do a 12-hour window. 7 to 7 is typically that time. And many other countries are 24 hours, or they might be a couple of days. And so that leads us to, because it's midweek and because it's their limited hours, it leads us to have a lower voter turnout. We have a lot of elections in this country. In the United States, you can pretty much guarantee that there is an election at least every other month. Okay, so we voted in November. The next one, there may be a special election in January. There might be, if you have to have a runoff or whatnot, there definitely one will be in February. So this is typically that February is for state issues or local school board voting. If it's a presidential year, you'll have an election in March. There'll be, a vote in April for something. I mean, we're voting almost every 2 months. Most countries are not like that. So people don't have this fatigue and getting very confused on what are we voting on now. They tend to save it up and they just do like 1 or 2 votes a year. Excuse me. Presidential versus parliamentary system. So we have a presidential, so we have to elect not just our congressional leaders, the legislative branch, but we also have to have an election for president, which will be very different. Under the parliamentary system, the people just go and elect the legislative group, and the legislative group then picks their prime minister. We have to pick both, and that leads to sometimes election fatigue and confusion. whoops, let me go back. And that also means that like for midterm elections, so in 2022, it's not a presidential election year. We're just doing congressional. Less people are going to show up because people put emphasis on the presidential election. All right, that wraps up the voters out of the elections and campaigns. If you have any questions, just let me know.